And welcome to the Social Justice Forums. I am your host, Daren Jaime, and we thank you for joining us. Now, if you're asking the question, what is the show about? We bring you a forum discussing and providing a deeper understanding of the issues and inequities that so many communities face, things such as systemic inequalities to pressing social problems. Our guests provide multiple perspectives as well as insights, helping us to better understand and address these challenges. So we invite you to stay connected to us. The Social Justice Forum starts now. And welcome back. In the year 2021, 31% of rural adults aged 25 and older held post-secondary degrees, compared to 45% of urban adults, with rural students unlikely to pursue degrees from private and selective schools. The question is, why is this? And what happens to a handful of rural students that attend elite colleges and universities? Today, we're going to tackle a critical but often overlooked gap in the American higher education system. And joining me now to address these questions that she actually poses in her book, Educated Out, How Rural Students Navigate Elite Colleges and What It Costs Them, is the Associate Professor of Education at Bates College, Dr. Mary Casey Tieken. And we thank you so much, Dr. Tieken, for joining us.
Such a pleasure to be here.
You make this interesting correlation, and really you talk about, people who live in rural environments, and, admittedly, not at the forefront of many people's minds, but yet and still, there's some significant data that comes out when it talks about rural students in education. And so I want to get you first to give me a little background as to what even got you interested in the topic.
Yeah, absolutely. So I began my career in education as a third grade teacher. And right about the time I got my first faculty job, I was starting to get graduation announcements from my third graders. And so they were graduating high school. And it became really clear to me how few of them were going on to higher education. So some of them going to community college, some of them were going to, go right into the workforce, some of them were getting trade certificates, but very few were going on to higher education, especially to four-year schools. And so I really began to wonder why. I mean, I knew this group of students really well. They were talented, they were smart, they were funny, they were thoughtful. So I knew it wasn't a question of, did they have the qualifications or did they have the aptitude? And so it was more about structure. And so I became really curious, why weren't they going? After a couple more years teaching at an institution of higher education, and I'm teaching at Bates College, which is a selective elite liberal arts college, my questions began to expand a little bit, and I began to wonder not just why weren't students not just why weren't rural students going, but what if they had gone? What would that have been like for them? I'm at a place where students don't seem to listen to country music. No one seems to be going four-wheeling on the weekends. No one seems to shop at Walmart. And so, what if these rural students had gone? How would they have experienced that? What would it have meant for them? What would it have meant for their families? And so that got me into looking at this. And so I followed a group of 9 rural first generation to college students at an elite college that I call Hilltop. And I look at how they experience this kind of elite environment and then what it means for them afterwards. So I follow them through graduation for a few more months after that and look at kind of what does happen after.
Yeah, pretty interesting that you land there. So we talk about geography and how geography and identity, sometimes they exist, sometimes it doesn't. They correlate, sometimes they don't correlate. What can you find as the correlation between geography and identity when it comes to rural students?
Yeah, I mean, this question of identity I think is really interesting because I think some of the students very much identified as rural. That was very much part of how they defined themselves. Some of those other students just didn't see that very much as a part of their identity. It wasn't kind of how they self-defined. But regardless of how they define themselves, they still faced various structural barriers throughout the process that were tied to geography. And there was this identity piece because even if they didn't identify as rural, society identified that for them. And so they grappled with that a little bit. And especially because these students, they were in college during the 2016 election. And so, of course, there was all sorts of narratives that emerged right after the election about rural voters, about how they voted. And they were hearing all this and trying to make sense of that too. And so I think that also made the rural identity pretty salient to them. And so they began to grapple with it more as their time went on during college.
And as rural students make their way to these elite universities, questions would be about the ability to really make that transition from a rural community sometimes to an elite school that is, definitely more popular, more populated, and at the same time, a lot more going on campus. How were they able to make the transition from rural to these elite schools?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, first they faced all kinds of barriers in making that transition. So many of the students, especially those that attended their local rural public high schools, they weren't as prepared as their non-rural counterparts, especially because they were at this elite school where many of their non-rural counterparts had attended pretty ritzy boarding schools. So they just didn't have the same level of academic preparation as the other students did, and so that manifested in all kinds of ways. In terms of some of them failed some classes, a few of them had to change their major plans. So they had gone in expecting to be pre-med, and pretty soon they were dissuaded from that pathway. So it came up, in academics in all sorts of ways. Also, there were some barriers that were related to just the cost of attendance. And these are kind of like the hidden costs of attendance. So, right, like the textbooks that cost money. Being able to socialize on, after classes or on the weekends, that also costs money. And so they encountered all these hidden barriers that kind of meant that they couldn't fully participate in the academic and social curriculum there. Um, and then as their time went on, they also faced barriers that related to their ability to be fully prepared for after college. So, an important part of being at a college is being able to do the internships or the job shadows. These opportunities often do not pay very much. And so many of these rural students, they couldn't afford to do those sorts of opportunities that look really, really good on the resume. They're great preparation for after college, but again, they don't pay well. So they had to, during the summers, they were going back home and they were earning money in order to be able to, fund their college years.
Right.
And so, again, like there were these barriers that sort of came up throughout the process, very much related to geography, that I think we often, as a society, just don't even really think about or look at. When we think about what rural students might be experiencing. And I think some of those go to explain that urban-rural gap that you opened this segment with. Why is there that gap? Well, part of it is because there are all these barriers that are built into the process.
And we're talking about two things. We're talking about opportunities, right? And then we're also talking about accessibility. And many times these opportunities are available, but yet and still the accessibility doesn't, exist. And maybe times there is accessibility, but no opportunity, right?
Right. I'm really glad that you brought up that distinction, because I think a lot of the administrators at Hilltop would say, like, look, we've got all these opportunities here. There's all these resources, right? We have the tutoring services. We have the internships. We have all these things that students can do. But you've really got to think about it from the student perspective and what it requires in order to be able to actually partake in those. So, access is more than just making sure the opportunity exists. We've got to make sure that students are aware of them, that any hidden costs that come with those opportunities, that those are covered, and that students feel comfortable in that environment as well.
Can you unpack a little bit more? Because I think when we're thinking about these rural students, people are like, okay, they're, maybe a little hard to travel and get to where you need to get to, but there's so many other barriers that maybe we're not considering. And, right here we are in the borough of the Bronx, big city, right? And millions of people. We've got, colleges, universities, a different kind of life. But what are some of those barriers that maybe we're unfamiliar with?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's, we can kind of think about these buckets, these barriers in sort of three different buckets. The first would be just in terms of applying. So we know, for example, that AP classes, advanced placement classes, which are really good preparation for college, colleges look for those on a student's application, right? Those are geographically uneven. So if you attend a really well-resourced urban high school, you might have dozens and dozens of AP classes to choose from. If you're attending a rural public school, you probably do not have that. You might be lucky to have one or two AP courses. So that means that rural students are coming in less prepared and with less, their resumes or applications are kind of filled with less of those sorts of activities. Also, you mentioned that, there in New York City, you've got all kinds of institutions of higher education around, right? In many rural areas, these are education deserts. So they don't have those same kinds of colleges there. And so imagine how much easier it is to go to college if you grew up right down the street from one, right?
Hmm.
And maybe, your friends are the kids of college professors, or maybe you went to soccer camp on a college campus every year, right? If you don't have those kinds of opportunities, higher education just feels less accessible. It just feels less like a real possibility for you. Many rural schools don't even have guidance counselors. And so they don't have the kinds of adults that are there in the community that can help prepare them and help students figure out FAFSA and all of those really uh, difficult systems, right, to unpack and to kind of navigate their way through. So there's all those sorts of barriers that come. And then when students arrive on campus, there are barriers too. So there's the hidden costs for just actually participating in activities that I mentioned. They're not being able to do the kinds of internships and job shadows that other students might not. And there's also just for some students, especially if they're going to a really large, more urban campus, a rural student might have a real hard time just navigating that campus. And there might be a lot of anxiety and just fear associated with that, just because it's so big and they've got to figure out bus systems and they've got to figure out all of these kinds of systems that they've never really encountered before. And then I think also, just proximity to wealth. Many of the students that I was following, they've never really been around the kind of very concentrated wealth that exists on many of these elite campuses. So they don't know how to necessarily interact in those spaces. And the other students might come in with all kinds of connections to one another that these rural students don't have. So they might even enter just sort of feeling already on the outside or on the margins of campus. And then when it comes to accessing opportunities after campus, after college, again, they might not have the resumes because they couldn't, participate in all of the internships and the job shadows. Then we also need to think about where our jobs are located. So most jobs for college educated workers are located in cities. So what this means for many rural students is that they do not have the option to return home or to return anywhere that's close to home or that looks like home after college. They've essentially been educated out, and this is where the title for my book comes from. And so this is a much higher price that these rural students have to pay and their families. So, the students, of course, can be much more difficult to maintain relationships, a lot more distance there. They have to be farther away from their families. But also these rural communities, they're losing this human capital. They're losing all this talent.
Right. Let me go back. You talked about families for a moment. Let me talk about parents of these students, right? Are similarities, differences? What are you finding with the makeup of some of these parents that are, of those that you researched and maybe even rural students that can bring into the equation?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I started following the students after they had already made the decision to attend Hilltop. So I'm kind of following a select group of parents to begin with and students. But what I found actually was that these parents, the students were not going in spite of their parents. And I think there's a lot of narratives that exist out there about, uneducated rural folks. They maybe don't value education or they don't want their kids to get an education. And I found that complete opposite. So these parents, we were so excited about their children going on to college. They were so proud of them. They didn't, of course, they didn't have the kind of college knowledge necessarily to help their students be able to fill out the FAFSA form, complete the applications, choose a major, all of those things that students that are from families where their parents went to college that they have access to. But these parents, they were huge advocates of college. And so I think, like I said, that this study really complicates that kind of narrative around this kind of stereotype as, of rural folks being uneducated or not interested in education, or I often hear the word backwards in all kinds of ways. Again, these parents were really, really big advocates. I've also worked with families that from rural areas that might be a little bit more questioning in terms of the value of higher education right now. But I think it's really important to keep in mind, again, this higher price that these rural parents have to pay when their kids go to college. For urban and suburban parents, when their children go on to college, there's at least the possibility that their children can return home or somewhere close to home after graduation. For these rural parents, that option just doesn't exist. So sending their kids to college, they know from the outset that it's likely their children will never come home. And that's, again, a really high price to pay, I think, for many rural communities and families.
As you think about these rural families and really getting their students ready, or their children ready, I should say, or young adults for college, Obviously, a lot of preparation goes into preparing them for this life-changing and sometimes life-altering experience, because when you're used to going to school in a in a rural environment, now you're coming out and going to an elite university. Big changes there. What are some of the pathways that parents can better prepare their their students for being able to make such a big adjustment?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the parents put it to her son this way. He came from a military family, and she told her son, going to college is a little bit like joining the military. It changes you.
Hmm.
And for me, that just really resonated for like, college does change you, right? And she's comparing it to changing you, in the same way that the military might change you and change your circumstances. Um, you know, I think I think the parents, they went into it with their eyes wide open. And I think the extent to which rural parents can talk to their children about that too, about the kind of changes that might be coming. And I want to be really clear that the children and their parents, they remained really, really close throughout their 4 years of college. So the students, they couldn't go to their parents for advice on choosing a major or writing a paper or any of those kinds of things. But they continued to go to their parents for what they would call life advice. And they really, really valued those relationships. They often went home. They went home quite a bit in ways that I actually felt like were really healthy and adaptive. And so, I think that these parents have really talked to their students about what going to college looks like and what it might mean for them and what it might mean for their family. And so I think those kinds of conversations are really important. One place I felt like there was a little bit of a rub was when the students entered Hilltop. They were hearing from their professors and they were hearing from their advisors. Go explore, take lots of classes, see what find your passion, kind of just be free. And their parents were much more concerned about. I want you to choose a major. I want you to know what career that's going to lead to, and you need to buckle down quick. And it was
Hmm.
really hard for the students to make sense of this kind of contradictory advice. And so, I think what I tell parents is that, it's pretty typical for students to spend their first year and a half to explore a little bit. I would also tell college faculty, though, you need to understand that many of our rural students, low income students, first generation students, they need to know that this degree is going to pay off in the long run. So
Right.
this advice of just kind of explore, just with kind of wild abandon, that might actually just not resonate very well, and it might put students in this kind of difficult place with their families. And so we need to, as faculty, we need to really help students navigate that and think about, okay, do the exploration, but let's also really be thinking very critically about what kind of careers each of these majors could open, what it could lead to.
For yourself, obviously, a great labor of love in making this book. Talk to us about the process, and how long did it take you really before you got to publish out, and what was that process like for you?
Yeah, so labor of love, it certainly was. Um, it was 13 years from when I got the initial grant that would fund this study to when the book was actually released. So it was a total labor of love for me, probably for my family as well. Um, and I followed two cohorts of students. So I actually spent 5 years collecting the data. It was a class of 2018 and 2019. And then pretty soon after that, the pandemic hit. And so I was spending a lot more time at home writing. I was also pregnant with my daughter at that time. And so it was kind of crazy to me. And I think also to the students, many of whom I'm still in touch with, like all of the big life changes that have happened in that period of time. I actually caught up with one of the students just a couple of weeks ago, and he told me he was turning 30. And I was like, oh my God, wow, this study really did take forever,
Hmm.
just in terms of like doing the research, doing the work, and following, getting it published, following them afterwards. But yeah, it's great. And I mean, I can't imagine 9 students that would just be more thoughtful. I mean, this group of students, I mean, they still kind of they live in my heart today because they were just such a great group, and I was so lucky to spend so many years with them.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, when you think about rural students, it's not the first thing that really comes to mind. So you're really bringing to light, something that's not really highly discussed. Out of all of the research that you did, what was some of the biggest takeaways that you had that maybe surprised you the most in the life of rural students going to elite schools?
Yeah, I think, the first thing I think I'll just say is that, really what the study explores is how geography structures college opportunity. So, we often think about how race and class structure college opportunity. I don't think we necessarily deal with it well and remove all those barriers, but I think there's some awareness of that. I think we're less aware of how geography actually plays that kind of structural role. And it's not just for rural students either. I think it's for students that grow up in places that are geographically marginalized. So yes, it might be rural, but it also might be students that are growing up in very, very urban environments. They also don't have access to the AP classes. They also can't return home after graduation, right? So, what I hope the study does is kind of bring to light all of these ways that geography matters to college access and how we as a country, as a society, can really be thinking about that for all of our students and all of our geographically marginalized students. And then just in terms of kind of, what surprised me or what really still sort of sits with me, I think it's that quote that I mentioned earlier, this idea that college changes you, kind of like the military does. And I really had not thought about the sort of magnitude of change, but when that mother really put it that way, it makes me realize again how much, and this was a mother also that lost one of her sons in Afghanistan. So she knows like the full cost of having a son that's in the military. And for her to still equate college and military really was just, wow, this is a big, big sacrifice for many of these families. And it doesn't need to be. I think there's all kinds of ways in which we can make it not so costly for rural students and families.
Yeah, you're leading into my next question about better supporting. How can there be better support available for rural students? If you had to name like three things off the top of your head, what would you think?
Yeah. So one, I think we need to think about how geography does matter. And so, in terms of admissions, colleges often just think about like, oh, do we have a student from Idaho? Do we have one student from Illinois? And they kind of check all 50 boxes. We need to be thinking about geography in a much more rigorous way and think about how really geography does structure college opportunity. And then we need to think about merit. And so many of these elite schools they want to welcome the students that are most deserving. Well, being able to encounter and overcome barriers related to geography, that is a sign of merit. And so we need to be able to think about that. And we also need to talk to students about how geography matters because many of these students, they individualized so many of the barriers they came across. So, a student will say, I'm just not a math person, rather than, oh, well, you know what? My rural high school did not prepare me very well in math because of how we fund our public schools, right? We fund based on property taxes. Low wealth rural places don't have the kind of property wealth to put towards their schools. And so maybe that's why we couldn't have an AP class. And so this thing I'm encountering, it's not about me. It's not about any deficiency on my part. It's about that structure. So kind of takeaway number one is I think critically about how geography really matters in terms of college opportunity. And then I think one of the other big takeaways for me was we need to really think carefully about how we might better align our economic policy and our education policy. And so this college attainment divide that you mentioned at the outset, it really matters, right? It matters in terms of wages, it matters in terms of revenue then for local areas. Also, this divide maps onto divides in health, divides in civic engagement, all kinds of other divides. So this divide is super important. And if we don't do something to address it, it's actually getting bigger over time, not smaller, right? And so part of it is in terms of making college more accessible for rural families and rural students, but it's also making sure that for the rural students that do want to be able to return home, that there are jobs there. So we need to incentivize making sure that there are companies coming to rural places and all these other geographically marginalized places I mentioned as well, so that the students that do want to be able to give back to their local community, they can do that. They don't have to choose, right, between college and home. They can actually have both.
And as you talk about both, I mean that's really the idea that to be able to have to have both. Rural students feel sometimes worlds away, and that's a fact. When you think about, hey, how far am I from community? That's worlds away. Is it a hard time, if you will, making that transition into community when sometimes in the rural community, there's that deficiency?
And so, yes, some of the times the students, they did have a hard time making that transition back home. And, especially because after a while, that transition was also about, they'd spent 2, 3, 4 years away, and they've been a part of a different environment and a different culture. And so they also loved going home. And I want to make that really, really clear. They saw their rural communities as assets or resources in their college journeys, not liabilities. Um, but that was a divide that they really had to navigate, and it was hard. But like I said, they remained really close to their families. Their relationships with some home friends, those sometimes became a little frayed, feeling like there were different goals in life, and those maybe became more and more diverging as time went on. But the students did remain quite close to their families. But yeah, returning home was hard too sometimes. As one student told me, like they became practiced at like navigating those two worlds and navigating that divide between. And one student told me, I'm making my own road. And so he wasn't fully doing the elite college thing. He wasn't fully the same kid from home as he once was, right? He was sort of figuring it out. And there can be sort of a strength, I think, that comes from learning how to navigate those divides and being able to go back and forth between those worlds. And so I'd remind the students of that sometimes, that they're gaining really important skills in kind of cultural navigation, sometimes political navigation, that were going to serve them really well throughout their life.
So for now that you have this research done, you got the book out, and people are reading and having an opportunity to do that. Talk to me about what do you want people to ultimately take away from this great time of writing and research that you put forth.
Yeah, so I think number one is, what I said before, that geography really does. It's a part of our opportunity structure. It is another one of those things that structures who has access and who doesn't have access. So we need to really think critically about that, identify those kinds of barriers, and then do what we can to dismantle them. And then I think also just making sure that people know that these students exist, and they defy so many of the stereotypes about rural America that exist out there. There are some pretty pernicious stereotypes about rural America being uneducated and backwards and all of those kinds of things. And these students, they completely dispel all of those myths. So I hope that's another big takeaway for readers.
Was that a myth that got dispelled for you, or what did you think going in?
No. I mean, I had spent plenty of time in rural America. I knew that there was that myth didn't hold any kind of water. But just in terms of, being able to know such a brilliant group of students so intimately for so long, it was an absolute pleasure and gift. And I'm excited to be able to share that with the world.
Yeah. And for those who want the social media to be able to tap into you and more about your work, how do they go about doing that?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn. I am not a big social media person, but find me
Okay.
on LinkedIn. I am, and I would love to connect, and I'm always happy to talk to folks about rural college access.
Well, I'm glad to have you here and glad to have you sharing with us here. Dr. Mara Casey Tieken, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. I really appreciated it.
We come to the end of our show. I want to thank you for joining us this week's discussion on the Social Justice Forum. Now, if you want to rewatch this week's edition, recatch Cablecast right here on Bronxnet.org. If you ever want to join in on the conversation and present your point of view, yes, we do have social media. You can go to that on Bronxnet TV. And then join us next week. We'll continue to elevate the discussion and bring further awareness across the globe. I am your host, Daren Jaime, saying take care and God bless.